What does it mean to be a Western yogi? How can someone who was born and raised in the West, who comes from a Judeo-Christian background, practice yoga and meditation in an authentic and genuine way? My name is Christopher Sartain, and this is the Western Yoga Podcast. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Western Yoga Podcast. I'm currently in Santiago, Chile, taking a break from our retreat center in southern Chile, and I'll be doing some traveling starting next week. I'll be in the United States, my home country, for about 2.5 months. I felt like it was time to take a break from Chile for a variety of reasons, and spend some time with friends and family in the States. I think it would be good for my mental health and my spiritual path right now to take an extended break from Chile. So that's what I'll be doing, and I'm looking forward to that, spending some time with friends and family. I also herniated 2 discs in my neck about a year ago, and that just never quite healed. It causes numbness or tingling in my hands that prevents me from doing a lot, although I've been doing everything anyway, just kind of stubborn and hard-headed, and so I haven't given my body time to heal properly. And so I thought it would be a good idea to go to the States and go somewhere where I can just rest and not have all of the duties and responsibilities that I have at our retreat center in the mountains. It's kind of a harsh lifestyle that we have there, and sort of a homesteader, hardcore lifestyle. And so I'm looking forward to just being a little more comfortable and getting some much needed rest. I've lived in Chile now for 9 years, and there's things about Chile that I really love. Some other things I don't love so much. Try to be objective and peaceful wherever I am, but none of us are Superman, and sometimes we need a change of scenery and a change of pace. So I'm looking forward to some much needed rest for a couple of months to heal. And I'll be working on a book. The working title of that book is The Jesus Sutras. And essentially it'll be a commentary of the Gospel of Thomas and some other sayings from the so-called Q source or Q material that I've spoken about in previous episodes. That is essentially the earliest written accounts of what Jesus taught and said. And so I'll be working on that book. I'm currently rereading The Formation of Q by John Kloppenborg, which is an excellent book and is really his seminal work, and an extremely important work as it concerns the study of Q, the Q source, the Q material, which predates the so-called canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it has a lot in common with the Gospel of Thomas. There are many shared verses in both, and so I'll be working on writing that book, which I've been looking forward to working on for some time, but I just haven't had enough free time to devote to it. So hopefully, during my stay in the States, I'll I'll have plenty of free time to devote to that book. And if you have not already listened to my previous episodes about the Gospel of Thomas and the Essenes and Q and all of that, I ask humbly that you go back and listen to all of those episodes. They're all basically called the Yoga of the Gospel of Thomas. There's a playlist on this YouTube channel if you're listening on YouTube. If not, if you are listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Podbean or wherever else, you can go through the episode lists and you'll see that all of them start with the Yoga of the Gospel of Thomas. And please go back and listen to all of those so you understand the history of the Gospel of Thomas and the Essenes and the Q source and all of that, so that you'll have context for understanding this episode. So I'm going to dive straight in, and we'll start with verse 34. And I'm reading the Thomas Lambden translation, by the way, in case you're interested. There are many translations of the Gospel of Thomas. I prefer the Lambden translation. So that's what I use in all of these podcast episodes devoted to the Gospel of Thomas. And if you're asking yourself at this point, if you're new to the podcast and you're asking yourself, well, I thought this was a YouTube channel about yoga, Kriya Yoga, or I thought this podcast was the Western Yoga podcast. Well, the Gospel of Thomas is essentially yoga philosophy, and or it's an Enlightenment tradition. Jesus was an enlightened master, and so his teachings are Enlightenment teachings, no different from yoga or certain Buddhist teachings or teachings from Vedanta or Advaita Vedanta, the so-called non-dual school of Vedanta. All of these Enlightenment teachings have many things in common because they were all started by enlightened beings, enlightened masters. And Jesus was an enlightened master, possibly one of the most enlightened beings who has ever lived. But his teachings were not understood when he lived during his lifetime, similar to the Buddha and other teachers from Kali Yuga. Jesus was born into Kali Yuga, which ended 300 years ago, according to Sri Yukteswar. I think maybe it ended maybe only a couple hundred years ago or 100 years ago, personally. I think we're still feeling the effects of Kali Yuga in many ways, and that we are essentially still living in a dark age. The evidence of that can be seen all around us. And so his teachings were not well understood during his lifetime, or really afterward. We're only now really awakening to what Jesus was all about, thanks to the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas in the 1940s in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. Okay? Although part of the Gospel of Thomas had been discovered prior to that in its Greek version, but only a few verses. And so the complete text was only discovered in the 1940s in Egypt, and it is a Coptic or Egyptian translation, but it matches very closely the older Greek version. Verse 34, Jesus said, "If a blind man leads a blind man, they will both fall into a pit." And here Jesus is talking about false prophets or charlatans. We still see plenty of those around today, don't we? It's very important that we learn from an enlightened person, who likewise learned from an enlightened person, who likewise learned from an enlightened person, and so on. That's why the idea of a lineage is so vital in yoga, in the yoga tradition. The idea of a lineage of masters is paramount in the yoga tradition. Otherwise, it's the blind leading the blind. And so, in my tradition, for example, of Kriya Yoga, my guru was Roy Eugene Davis. He was an enlightened being who learned from Paramahansa Yogananda, an extremely enlightened being who learned from Sri Yukteswar, who learned from Lahiri Mahashaya, who learned directly from Mahavatar Babaji, an avatar similar to Jesus, who was a very, very enlightened being. And so Babaji transmitted his enlightenment to Lahiri Mahashaya, who transmitted it to Sri Yukteswar, who transmitted it to Yogananda, who transmitted it to my teacher, who transmitted it to me. And so it's very important when you're choosing a teacher. Well, oftentimes you don't choose a teacher, it just sort of happens. It's like cause and effect, or sort of like the law of attraction, as it were. In yoga, we say, when the student is ready, the master appears. That is certainly the case, and was certainly the case in my own life, and having spoken to many others on this path, that was their particular situation as well. And so it's not like we should go guru shopping and choose a teacher. Oftentimes, the teacher just appears when you've been adequately prepared to receive that transmission. And so it's important that your teacher is enlightened. You might think, whoa, gosh, well, that's obvious, that's common sense. Well, in this dark age that we're living in, not so much. And there are plenty of charlatans running around out there teaching nonsense. And they have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of doe-eyed followers. And so you might think, oh, well, it's common sense. It's obvious that, you should have an enlightened teacher. But in our particular dark age, common sense is not very common, unfortunately, and people are easily manipulated. Very, very easily manipulated. The evidence of this can easily be seen all around us as people believe whatever they're told in the mainstream corporate media outlets, and they blindly follow politicians, for example, or they blindly follow whatever they're told by corporations and corporate interests. And this is evident all around us. People are easily manipulated, easily duped, easily hoodwinked, easily conditioned and programmed and brainwashed in our current age. Extremely susceptible to false propaganda, and are incapable of using their discernment to see through lies, half-truths, and manipulations. And so, if you're lucky enough, fortunate enough, blessed enough to discover an enlightened being that you can learn from, take full advantage. Take full advantage. You're extremely lucky, extremely blessed, extremely fortunate if that is your case. And so you should take full advantage of that opportunity that very few people are given. It's incredibly important that you learn from someone who is awake. and discerning. And ideally, from your own culture. It's not necessary. It's not necessary. But it is better. It is better if you can learn from someone who's from your own culture. I learned from a Westerner, and I'm a Westerner. And that proved very useful for me in my path, because he had experienced a lot of the situations and circumstances in his life that I also had to experience, because he was a Westerner from the United States and all that. So that was extremely useful, because he spoke my language, you see. And he went through a lot of the cultural things that I've had to go through. And so that was extremely useful for me on my path. Again, it's not necessary. Of course, he learned from Paramahansa Yogananda, who was from India, although when he was learning from Yogananda, Yogananda had already lived in the United States for 28 years at that point. So he was fully adapted at that point to the West. But anyway, you understand what I'm saying. Ideally, it's not a necessity. But in my personal opinion, and please, take all of my opinions with a grain of salt. But if you can find someone from your own culture who's more relatable to learn from, that's ideal. That's an ideal situation. And so we don't want the blind leading the blind. I just heard recently a fairly popular uh, woman, a female guru um, from India, stating that, I'm trying to remember what she said exactly, but something like, there's no wrong way to meditate if you're sitting. What did she say? She said there's no wrong way to meditate. If you're sitting down to meditate at all, then you're doing it right. These are the kind of teachings that occurred during a dark age. And many people believe, this, and I don't want to name names, but she's fairly well known, and has tens of thousands of followers, I'm sure, possibly more. And this is what she's teaching people. And so this is the kind of thing that you find in a dark age, when even the so-called enlightened people uh, are anything but. I'll just say that. They're anything but enlightened. And yet they have tens of thousands of followers. So this is a symptom of the age in which we find ourselves. Of course there's a proper way to meditate. Of course there's a good way to practice meditation, or a superior way to practice meditation. And we can learn how to meditate proficiently, successfully, so that we have the opportunity to experience our essence of being, our true nature, which is the goal of meditation. Just sitting there, I'm sorry, but just sitting there with, a million thoughts going through your head's not going to get you too far. It's not going to be very, very useful for you, or very practical. You're just wasting your time. So if you're just sitting there doing whatever, no. You can learn how to meditate well. You can learn how to meditate proficiently, as I did, as all of Mr. Davis's students did. I was just talking about this the other day with one of Mr. Davis's other disciples, one of my brother disciples. And we were just discussing, how much bad information is out there regarding meditation. right now. And, Mr. Davis told me one time, I don't remember the exact percent, but I think he said something like, 90% of people currently teaching meditation should not be. Because they've never experienced, uh, samadhi or so-called, you know, states of union, divine union, samadhi, yoga, and they've never experienced those states, and yet they're teaching people how to meditate. It's like working with a tour guide who's never been to the places that they're going to take you to. So they don't know anything about the places where they're taking you. And so they're blindly leading you along without any knowledge of where they're going, what they're doing, what they'll find once they're there. And so Jesus says, if a blind man leads a blind man, they will both fall into a pit. Yeah. So be careful, folks. There's plenty of charlatans out there and grifters, spiritual grifters, who are just trying to make a quick buck, sell books, Be careful. There's a lot of that going on. And there's really very few, I have to say, um, very few qualified, we'll use that word, teachers in the world today. Very few. I was extremely fortunate. All of Mr. Davis's students were extremely, extremely fortunate. And I was just talking with my brother disciple about that the other day. Just how blessed and fortunate we were to spend time with a truly enlightened being who had learned from a truly enlightened being, who had learned from a truly, etc. So on and so forth. It's a lineage. It's an unbroken chain of transmission of enlightened consciousness that exists within a lineage. And it's not just a transmission of knowledge and techniques and philosophy. It's a transmission of awakened Shakti pot, energy, and awakened consciousness that occurs between guru and disciple. When this transmission is functioning correctly, all of these things are transmitted successfully. And so yes, of course you can learn how to meditate proficiently to stages of superconsciousness and samadhi if you're learning from someone who's experienced those things. I often hear teachers describing samadhi as simply a peaceful, thought-free state of objective awareness. That is not samadhi. That it's a preliminary state of superconsciousness, which is beneficial. Most people never even experience that, a prolonged, thought-free state of objective awareness. And so it is good to experience that, obviously, but that is not the peak experience, and that is not samadhi. What they're describing is a preliminary state of superconsciousness, but not samadhi. And so, and some of these people I respect and consider them to be fairly enlightened, but when I hear their descriptions of samadhi, it's quite obvious they've never experienced samadhi, and that's disappointing. And so you have to be very, very careful with the teachers that you work with, and Jesus here is warning us of that in this verse 34. Moving on, verse 42. Jesus said, "Become passers-by." Jesus said, "Become passers-by." What is a passerby? It's someone who's not participating in whatever activity is going on. And so when you meditate, when you're practicing your sadhana, you want to be objective. So, in other words, when you have thoughts, when you have emotions, when you have desires, when all these so-called vrittis or fluctuations or distractions arise in your field of awareness, you don't participate in them. You walk by them without participation. You pass by them without reaction, without identification, without participation, without judgment, without analyzing anything. You just walk by them. You pass by them. Any vritti, any vibratory phenomenon that occurs in your field of awareness, you observe it objectively. This is what the Buddhists erroneously call mindfulness. It has nothing to do with the mind. You're observing the mind. And so it's, again, we live in a dark age where even so-called enlightened people describe things poorly. And mindfulness is not a good description of what's occurring. A better way to describe this is objective observation. Dispassionate objectivity. Objectively observing whatever comes up. Whatever vibratory phenomenon appears, you simply observe it objectively, without reaction, without participation, without identification, without judgment. And so that's what Jesus is describing here. Dispassionate objectivity, or objective observation of the vibratory phenomenon. Maya, in other words. The grand illusion. The matrix. Detachment. We learn how to detach our awareness and observe everything neutrally and objectively. And that's what Jesus is describing here. Verse 47. Jesus said, "It is impossible for a man to mount 2 horses or to stretch 2 bows, and it is impossible for a servant to serve 2 masters. Otherwise he will honor the one and treat the other contemptuously. No man drinks old wine and immediately desires to drink new wine. And new wine is not put into old wineskins, lest they burst, nor is old wine put into a new wineskin, lest it spoil it. An old patch is not sewn onto a new garment, because a tear would result." So what he's describing here is what most people on the spiritual path, myself included, confront from time to time. And that is the temptation to keep one foot on the sense-pleasure roller coaster ride, or emotional roller coaster ride, the roller coaster of reactivity and involvement in the world of the senses, and the other foot on the path to what the Buddha called nirvana, or this desireless state of perfect and lasting peace, durable, permanent peace. And so you can't do both. In other words, you can't have your cake and eat it too. This is another common teaching that we hear in this dark age in which we find ourselves, usually from people that claim that what they're teaching is Tantra, and that it's okay to have a sort of hedonistic lifestyle and be spiritual at the same time. Which, by the way, is not what Tantra teaches. Most people who say that they're teaching Tantra have probably never read any Tantric texts. One reason for that is because the vast majority of Tantric texts have not yet been translated into Western languages. There's only really a handful. So a lot of people that claim to be teaching Tantra have no idea what they're talking about, and that they've never really studied Tantra because they don't speak those languages or read those languages in which most of the tantric texts are written. Be careful, folks. I'll say it again, there are a lot of charlatans and spiritual grifters in our world today who have no idea what they're talking about and pretend to have more knowledge than they actually do. And so what Jesus is saying here is you can't serve two masters. You can't have one foot in the world and the other foot on the spiritual path. You're either in the worldly path or you're on the spiritual path. You can't be enjoying this sense pleasure roller coaster and also be on the path to enlightenment. You can't have all these attachments and aversions, and yet, you're trying to experience permanent lasting peace, and yet you have all these attachments and aversions, which cause reactions, which cause suffering, you see. When you have attachments and aversions, you react. Because you like this thing, attachment, you don't like that thing, aversion, so you either react positively or negatively to every situation and circumstance that arises in your life. And so you're riding the roller coaster. You're not peaceful. You're on the roller coaster ride of restlessness, constant restlessness. This is the opposite of the spiritual path, you see. So you can't do both, unfortunately. And that's what Jesus is saying here in this verse. And so be careful with people out there claiming that they're teaching Tantra and that it's okay, for example, to use drugs, drink alcohol, have a lot of different sexual partners, and participate in these sort of restless activities that create more restlessness because you're never satisfied, are you? You always need a little bit more. Life is a drug like that, And so they say, yeah, it's okay to do all that and try to experience permanent and lasting peace. Good luck with that. You can do experiments in your own life. Just see if it works. See if it works. I promise you it doesn't. All the spiritual masters throughout all the ages, like Jesus, like Buddha, have told us that doesn't work. And the yoga teachings also, if you read the yoga texts, like the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the Bhagavad Gita, etc., they all say the same. All the spiritual masters say the same. You can't serve two masters. You can't have your cake and eat it too. So make a decision. Choose. What do you really want? Do you want to experience permanent and lasting peace? Or do you want to keep riding that ride, man? It's up to you. Every day you're given a choice. Every day you're given a choice. You can either be restless or you can be peaceful. The path towards peace is a daily superconscious meditation practice and a disciplined yogic lifestyle. The path towards restlessness is everything else. And so every day we're given a choice. And Jesus tells us we need to choose. We need to choose and stick with the path. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Western Yoga Podcast. I hope you'll share it with others. Next week, I'll be interviewing a good friend of mine, Ryan Kurzak, who is another brother disciple of Mr. Davis, and someone I really respect and admire. And so that should be a really wonderful conversation. And I think that I will probably publish that as the next episode after this one. Many blessings. Namaste.